What up, YouTube? Welcome to part 1 of my Amiga 500 restoration video. And as you can see, the Amiga is not sitting on the workbench. That is because if you watch the unboxing, you know that I just bought the computer alone with no peripherals. So there's no way I have to test it. So I had to put together the peripherals to test it. And what I need to test it is I need a way to connect it to a monitor, and I need a power supply. Now the Amiga 500, the model I have on the bottom says it requires 5 volts DC at 4.5 amps, 12 volts at 1 amp, and negative 12 volts at 0.1 amps. So, and from what I've been reading, the negative 12 volts or the dual polarity 12 volts is only used for the amplifier, the audio amplifier circuit. So I was thinking of different ways to put together those voltages into one housing. And on the Amiga 500, you actually switch the power on and off on the power supply housing that came with it. So I was thinking about different ways to put it together, and the price would add up pretty quickly trying to put together 5 volt and plus or minus 12 volt power supplies. So then I watched a video where a guy took a ATX power supply and used it for his Amiga 500, and that works out perfectly because ATX power supply has 5 volts and plus or minus 12 volts. And as you can see, I had this laying around too. So this came out of my Windows XP computer, and this is a Earthwatts, Antec Earthwatts power supply. This wasn't a cheap power supply. This is a decent power supply, but you know, and I kind of felt bad of pulling it out of that computer that I don't use anymore. But the thing is, this power supply is worth nothing. I Google searched it. This power supply is only worth $30. So having it lay around, not being used at all, it's worth hacking it up to use it for this project. And as you can see, it has plenty of output power: 20 amps on the 5 volts, 17 amps on the positive 12 volts, and 0.8 amps on the negative 12 volts. So this is way more adequate. And I guess it is a little beefy. And maybe in the future, if the Amiga works out pretty well, maybe I'll try to put together a smaller power supply, but this is what I'm doing for right now. So the Amiga uses a special 5-pin connector, and on eBay for $8.50 plus shipping. So I think this was like $11. I was able to get a brand new connector. So I didn't think that was a bad deal at all. And then now we have to worry about the video. So the Amiga does have a composite out, but it's grayscale only. And the connector is a special, and the real video out is an RGB signal that goes through a DB23 connector. Now, the DB23 connector is an oddball connector that they do not make anymore, and so you're buying old surplus, and it seems like the Amiga community has wiped out the female connectors for the DB23. You can only buy male connectors. So what I'm going to do there, I was browsing eBay, and this one guy was selling VGA. This one guy was selling DB23 to VGA connector for the Amiga 500, and he had like 60 of them in stock. And at first they were like 20 bucks, and I was like, well, maybe I'll have to just buy that to hack it up to use it. But then he showed a close-up of the DB23 connector, and he literally took a DB25 connector and took a Dremel tool and cut off 2 pins. So I'm going to do that. The other option was on Thingiverse. Some guy actually printed out the design for a DB23. The only thing is, if you 3D print it, the power is going to be, if you 3D print it, the heat is going to be a factor in trying to solder it together, because you know, PLA melts at 215 degrees Celsius. But I think a better option is to hack up a DB25 connector, which I think I have DB25 connectors sitting around. I'm not 100% sure. I had to go through my stuff. So anyway, I'm going to do that, hack up a DB25 connector to make a DB23 connector. And then off of Amazon for a little under 20 bucks, I bought this board that's used in the arcade industry for if you want to swap out your CRT for a LCD screen. It's a RGB to VGA out converter. So I got this a little under 20 bucks. This was the cheapest way to convert the signal. And this also takes a separate power source. It says DC 5 to 12 volts. And it comes with this little JSP jack. So I'm going to go and also, while I'm slicing up this for the Amiga power supply, I'm also going to wire this in to power this. So I use one power supply for everything. So enough rambling on, let's dive into it. Okay, so what I did is I opened up the power supply and I went ahead and cut short every single lead that I wasn't going to use, so then that way I don't have a whole bunch of extra wires hanging out. And originally I was going to desolder it from the board, but they're glued to the board as strain relief, so that would be a pain. I cut them real short with flush cutters, so I don't think they're going to short out or anything. So on the ATX power supply, there is a green wire, which you see right here. I cut it off and I soldered it to a ground. That's the PSU on. The power supply won't turn on unless that green is connected to ground. So I did that and now it'll stay inside the case. I also took an extra wire that I had and I connected it to the shield, which is the same thing as ground on the board, but connected it to the shield because there is a shield on the pinout for the Amiga. So then all my extra wires, I bundled them up and brought them out here. ATX has standard color codes. So yellow is your 12 volts, blue is your negative 12 volts. The gray is the extra cable I use for the shield. Red is your 5 volts, and black is ground. And I got the pin out of the connector off the internet, so hopefully it's right. I'm going to double check my voltages now. And then also I have an extra 12 volts in ground that I'm going to go and solder to this connector for the RGB to VGA converter. Okay, I'm getting kind of a little impatient, so I got the connector all together and it came out pretty good and nice and clean. So I'm just going to go ahead and power it up. I have the Amiga 500 plugged into my TV using the component mono cable. And I went and I double checked the voltages. I have all my voltages right and the pinout right according to the diagram I got off the internet. So if that's wrong, I'd be out of luck. So let me, power supply's turned off. Let me plug it in. And make sure these aren't touching anything. And then I'm going to plug in the power connector. Nice and tight fit. So it feels good. And then, I'm sorry for the bad lighting in my bedroom. I have bad lighting. But let's see if we let the black magic smoke out of it. Oh. We got a gray screen. We got the power light flickering. Caps lock key works. The LED on the caps lock key works. So, this is exactly how the guy on eBay described it. He said he plugged it in, power light was flickering, and he got a gray screen. He said he had a known good working Amiga. He tested out the floppy drive, and he tested out the keyboard, and it worked good on the known good Amiga. Now, I think now the Amiga has color codes for faults, and gray is a color code, and usually gray means that it's a low level fault, meaning that a chip's not communicating or what have you. I'm thinking that this is actually a green fault, which a green fault means you have a problem with your RAM or your CIA chips. There's 2 CIA chips for your peripherals. I have a feeling that this screen is actually a green screen, but since we're in mono, because I have a feeling that guy didn't have a Commodore monitor laying around. I'm thinking that this is actually a green screen, but we will never know. We won't know that until we hook that RGB to VGA converter up, and that's the next step. I have my 12 volts ready to solder on the JSP connector, and then we got to figure out how we're going to do the DB23 connector. But no black magic smoke. I don't smell any burning smell, so we're off to a good start. Okay, so I went ahead and I connected this connector to 12 volts. Now the board says 5 to 12 volts. The manual for the board says 5 volts only, but online people were saying that this thing can draw quite a bit of current. So if you run it off of 12 volts, it will obviously draw less current because of the more voltage. So I'm going to hook it up to 12 volts. So I had this PC board DB25 connector laying around. And obviously it's not solderable, but I want to have something to at least start testing this Amiga. So I took a hacksaw and I cut off the last 2 pins and I tested it. It does fit into the Amiga without messing up the Amiga connector. So you pretty much connect your RGB, and then you connect your ground, and you connect your C-Sync to yellow, which goes into this connector right here on the board. And a lot of people are saying connect a 680 ohm resistor to C-Sync so you don't burn out this board. But some people are saying that was causing that was dimming it down too much for no sync. So I put a 120 ohm resistor in. I don't think you probably need a resistor at all. People are concerned about burning up the board without a resistor. I don't think that's a legitimate concern, but that's why I just settled with 120 ohms. Now, as you can see, this was a PC board connector, so I just kind of trimmed off the connectors. Very sloppy. I'm not proud of this work at all, but I just want something so I can start doing some preliminary testing on the Amiga. Eventually, if I get the Amiga running right, I'll probably create a better solution. But yeah, we are ready to hook this up to a monitor and see if we get RGB video out of the Amiga. Okay, I have everything hooked up. Very sloppy, but everything's hooked up. Got the power supply giving power to the board and giving power to the back of the Amiga. I have the RGB connector of the Amiga connected to the board, and the VGA of the board's connected to the VGA, the small little monitor that I had. So let's see if I let the black magic smoke out. Okay, we are not getting any video. So now another thing is VGA. So we weren't even on VGA. Okay, so now we're on VGA. Okay, so now that no signal is coming from this board. It's not coming from... Uh-oh. Now there is an auto button on this board. But I read on a review that you can't trust the board to pick up the right signal. The problem is when we hit menu, it's all in Chinese. Okay, we're back. I watched a YouTube video, and to change it to English is 4. No, this one's different. Okay. Menu. Let's try 5. There we go. English. Oh, what was that? Oh, what is that? Did you see that? We had a green screen, which is good. That shows us that I was right. It was outputting a green screen, not a gray screen. But it's losing sync. So let me... Oh, is it a bad solder connection? Okay, it's very crappy, but we do get a signal when I connect the gray wire up. So I'm going to go and swap the yellow for the gray wire. Okay, I swapped the yellow wire for the gray wire, and I'm still going through the resistor. And we have a green screen. There is a little bit of stuff on the top of the screen. But it's a solid green screen. So yeah. Cool. So that means that it's a RAM problem or a CIA chip problem. So we're off to a good start. I think I'm going to end this video here. So we are now set up that we can properly troubleshoot this Amiga with a screen and a power supply. And on the next video, we'll pick up actually opening up the motherboard, taking a look inside, and trying to see if we can get past this green screen. See ya.